Hey everybody, welcome back to Meanwhile. I'm so glad to be able to be with you wherever you may be tonight as we continue to talk about this idea of what God might be doing when we can't see Him at work. I really had a great vacation. I was glad to have some time off last week, and so it's really good to be back with you tonight to continue this idea. And I just want to say this, if you're watching this and you're watching this for the first time and you'd like to be a part of our Zoom discussion, for next week, you can just send us an email at the church, contact the church office. We'll send you a link, and then after this teaching is over, we're going to have kind of a part two of a discussion time where we can go through some of the things that you might be feeling or some of the discussion questions that I posted online. Last week I talked to you about this idea, or last time I was here, about this idea of perseverance. And I said that we are perfected through perseverance. We talked through James and looked at his first chapter. Spend some time kind of trying to parse out this idea of what it is actually happening when we face adversity. And I said that perseverance grows our faith, and that God is actually doing something in the midst of adversity. And what I want to do with you tonight is kind of take that and spin it just a little bit in a new direction to kind of get us moving deeper into this idea. Because when you hear that, perseverance can sometimes mean like I just survived, right? But I'm not talking about survival, I'm talking about resilience. And I think the Bible is talking about resilience. So here's an example of what I mean. When you look throughout the Bible at stories of characters who experienced great adversity, sometimes their stories end with them making it through by the skin of their teeth, but most of the time, those characters actually made it through and they were stronger on the other side than they were when they began. And I think that's the difference between survival and resilience. Listen to the way Jesus talked about this for a minute. He said in John chapter 16, one of my favorite verses, when he was discussing what was going to happen to him with the disciples, he said, "I have told you these things so that you in me will have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world." Jesus didn't say I have made it through the world. He didn't say that I have survived the world. No, he said I overcame the world. And this overcoming by Jesus has given us peace in the midst of trouble. And that to me sounds like more than just surviving. Now, you know this to be true. We want not just to survive, we want to be resilient. And I want to give you a definition for resilience, because when we think about this word for a minute, it can mean a lot of different things. And so in the context of what we're going to talk about tonight, I want it to mean this. It simply just means bouncing back from disruption. Now think about the word disruption for a minute. When we live our lives, we face all sorts of disruptions, right? And some things are small, some things might be big, but disruptions come almost every day. On the far end of the small side of the spectrum of disruption, you can think about things like the weather. It rained on your way to work and you weren't expecting it, so you didn't take an umbrella. Or your phone died and you weren't expecting that because you didn't take a charger with you. Or there was too much pollen and your nose was running this morning. Or it was colder than you expected it to be. The weather messed you up and you didn't take a jacket. Those are kind of small disruptions, but they're disruptions. They're things that are changes we weren't anticipating, things that happen in our lives that we weren't ready for. Now, as the spectrum of disruption kind of grows, there's things on the other side of it that are much bigger, right? Health problems that come along, diagnoses we weren't expecting or anticipating, things that take our life and shift them in a new direction, relational struggles and adversity. Think about all the stories we've talked about with Paul over the past few weeks of the relational trauma and the struggle that he faced and the dark depths of despair that led him into. Thinking about other things that go on in our lives that are disruptions, dealing with how our kids are growing, our aging kids, our growing kids, and the transitions and what's going on in their lives and what soccer practice you got to get them to, and then they've got prom and they've got all those other things and those disruptions that change kind of the flow of what we think about. And then I think me as a parent, we just had the birthday for my youngest. She just turned 4 a few days ago, and that means kindergarten's around the corner. And that just in me, I got to tell you, we sat at the dinner table the other night and we lit the candles on this birthday cake, and I have tears in my eyes thinking, how are you 4? How did this happen? That was a change I wasn't anticipating. It was a disruption in my normal emotional state. But things are going to get even more complicated than that, because when you think about severe relational struggles, you think about things that might happen that turn your marriage upside down, or that turn your job upside down. You lose your job, you lose your financial stability. Those are serious changes. And I think we don't like disruption because at the end of the day, it's really just change. I read this quote the other day that I really find fascinating about change. It says this: change is avalanching upon our heads and most people are grotesquely unprepared to cope with it. Wow, right? Like, Alvin, what on earth was going on in your life to make you say that, right? But the truth is, most of us are unprepared to cope with change. And I think there's this layer of resilience that comes along to tell us that this is how we deal with or go through change. But as we get older, it becomes more and more complicated to deal with. Now, there's two things I want to say before we go any further. One, we're going to talk about this idea of how to cope with change. We're going to talk about the biblical idea of resilience tonight. But I want you to hear my heart before we go any further. I know that there are things that can go on in our lives that are really serious. And I know some of you all probably are watching this even tonight, going through relational struggles or going through struggles in your finances, or you're dealing with job loss, or COVID-19 has just turned your whole world upside down. And it would be silly of me, it would be rude of me, absurd of me to think that anything that I could say tonight would give you exactly what you need to be able to feel a positive emotional response about what you're feeling right now. That's not what I'm saying. In fact, we're going to focus more on some of the little things that come our way, because I think what the Bible tells us, especially looking at the chapter in James we looked at 2 weeks ago, is that as we persevere through adversity, even the small things, that leads us to a resilience to deal better with the big things. So in other words, whether you consider yourself a resilient person or not, I just want you to know that whatever is happening right now, those little somethings, even the most least meaningful somethings, are preparing you to deal with the bigger somethings that may be coming down the road. Now, I want to show you something. And I'm a graphics person, so we're going to throw this up on the screen for you for a minute. And it may be something that you're familiar with, or maybe something you've never seen before. But this is called the change curve. And I didn't invent it. In fact, if in high school psychology, you probably saw this. It came out in the late 60s. But it's this idea of how every human being kind of deals with change. And if you look at this on the kind of the y-axis, right, it says morale. That's kind of how you're feeling, what your emotional state is. And then on the bottom is time. So here's what I want you to see about what's actually happening every time any of us face disruption or any of us face change. Everybody goes through this process, okay? The first thing that happens is we're kind of shocked, right? We're surprised at what actually came. We just can't believe that this has happened. And then we move into a place of disbelief and denial. So our morale actually goes up going like, that's not actually what's going on. That's not actually something serious. But then we move into a place where we kind of start the curve downward. We become frustrated about the change that's come our way, or the difficulties that we're facing, all the way down into this place of despair or depression, okay? So that's the lowest end of the curve. We get to a place where our mood is shot. We get to a place where we realize that the change that has come our way, the difficulty or the adversity or the trial or the struggle or the health problem or the financial problem or whatever it might be, that has led us down into a really dark valley, right? The Bible talks all the times about the valley of the shadow of death. That's kind of this area. But then what happens is we begin an uphill climb. There's acceptance, all right, engagement with the reality of what has changed, and then we start making decisions, and then we move into this place where we're actually kind of thriving. And in fact, all the way on the other side, you're actually doing better on the other side than you were before the initial change. Now, here's the thing. This is the process that all of us go through, all right? Every single one of us, when we're faced with change, we go through this. And whether you're a fan of psychology or not, whatever, this is just kind of how every human being is wired. And it's existed for 50 years now, and it's really tough to challenge because all of us have probably experienced this on varying levels. Now, how far down in the valley you go based on your adversity that you're feeling is dependent upon, kind of where you start and a lot of other factors, but this essential curve matches for everybody. And what I'm starting to realize the older I get is that this becomes more complicated, and the depth of this adversity, this depression moment, gets deeper for me the older that I get. Let me give you an example. When we found out we were going to be moving here, I had at the time 3 small children, and we had our 4th on the way. Carson was actually born when we got here, which was really exciting for us because that meant Kelly and Jim got to be at the hospital, and it was kind of cool. But we were expecting our 4th. We had 3 children. We had 2 that were actually in school. And my wife and I know as Methodist pastors in the family that we get moved and it happens, and we're going to have to deal with those changes as they come. And we were kind of anticipating this, and we thought when we told the children we would do the best we could to break it to them in a way that they would accept. And so we sat them down one night together, and we said, "Listen, guys, I know you really like it here in Carrollton, but we got a new opportunity, and we're going to move to a new place, and we get to have our own house, which would be exciting. No more parsonage for a while, And the look on my kids' faces was amazing to me because, we kind of lined up by age. And my oldest son looked like he was ready to drive a truck through our house. And then my daughter was a little more okay with it. And then my youngest, who was there was like, yay, right? And what I started to realize is that they all went through this process. My son's was probably, a week, and my middle daughter was probably like 4 days, and like my youngest daughter, it was more like 6 seconds, right? More like 6 seconds of this whole process, like, oh, that means we have to move further away from grandma, but hey, new house and backyard, I'm good, right? And when I watched this process kind of unfold for them, I started to realize, well, why? Like, why is it that they were able to move faster or slower depending on where they are? And I think the answer is resilience, because resilience is a catalyst in our life. Resilience is almost like the rubber band of our faith. When our faith is tested and through perseverance and through adversity, when we persevere through difficult times, our faith is stretched. But it's not just like a rubber band, because you've stretched rubber bands before, right? And sometimes they snap or sometimes they thin out. It's really amazing that when our faith is stretched and we persevere, it actually grows and it becomes thicker and wider and more elastic. And so it doesn't snap back to originally where it was, it snaps back better than it was. And so really, resilience is what reduces this whole thing. It's what reduces the time it takes for us to go through this process. And in fact, I think it even reduces how dark and how deep we go when we face those difficult times. Resilience, biblical resilience, based on faith in Jesus and understanding of what he has accomplished for us and the hope that's been planted in us, it changes the way we deal with adversity. So we as Christians are not just persevering, we're growing. We're constantly growing and being molded by the adversity that we change, no matter how big or how small. And you know this to be true. Every time you faced a difficulty, even if it was a small one, let's think about it for a minute. You got caught in traffic on your way to work, and you had a choice to make, right? You're going to be late for a meeting that you needed to be there for, and you have a choice to make in your mind. You can, decide very quickly to start blaming everyone that's around you, or you can get angry and let the bitterness kind of take root. And you're probably going to go through all of those emotions whether you wanted to or not. But the quicker you kind of make yourself realize that there's bigger things going on, and you've experienced things like this before, and God has led you through last time and it'll lead you through this time, the quicker this curve goes. The faster you make it from the shock of what just happened down through the kind of the dark moment up into being better because of what happened. Paul talked about this in Ephesians. And I want you to back up, remember with me for a minute, kind of some of the stuff we talked about with Paul's relationship with the Ephesians and his relationship with the Corinthians, and some of the things that happened to him, the relational trauma that ended up happening to him. I think that's a backdrop for what he says. This is like one of the last few things that he says to the Ephesians. And it's his prayer for them. It's kind of the benediction of his letter. He says, I pray that out of his glorious riches he may strengthen you with power through his Spirit in your inner being. After talking about the adversity that we're going to face and kind of the rough road the Ephesians were going to feel, he says, I hope God strengthens you. He didn't say, I hope God brings you through by the skin of your teeth. I don't hope that God kind of drags you kicking and screaming and that you're still on fire when you get there, but you've made it. No, I hope God strengthens you in your inner being. Paul had been through such a roller coaster with this curve in his own life, and he'd been here. And I'm going to guess that most of us as adults, the older we get, the more times we end up here. But what Paul realized was what made him not go so deep each and every time was his reliance on the strength of Christ. That he had broadened his perspective for what was actually happening. 2 weeks ago when we talked about perseverance, we talked about changing our perspective on adversity. What ends up happening when you change your perspective on adversity is you get more resilience and you gain more strength from Christ. By praying that prayer I gave you a few weeks ago by saying, like, God, help me to see what it is that you're doing right now, that strengthens you in your inner being. But he's not done. He says, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. He makes that connection to faith again. That as we face adversity and as difficult times have come, it is a testing and a persevering of our faith that will lead to us being more and more and more elastic and more strong and more resilient. And I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power. I like that. Now, he doesn't quit there, but I want to pause there for a minute. That it's not saying that, so you may get by. So you may slide through. So you may end up okay. No, so you may have power. So you may have power. Not just any power, the power to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ, and to know that this love surpasses knowledge. I think the thing that I've learned about resilience is that it surpasses human logic so many times. And it's really hard to realize you're gaining resilience because I don't think resilience is something you're born with, just to be completely honest. I think it's something that you gain through adversity and you gain through experience. As you persevere, you become more and more resilient because you have something to lean on. You have something to trust in. And so Paul is saying this surpasses human knowledge. This surpasses what we can figure out on our own. This depth and width and length and height of this love of Christ. And to know that this love surpasses knowledge. Resilience gives you a different perspective on things. It makes you look at the world differently. Because being resilient as a Christian, having the character of resilience as a Christian, means that you can say things with all confidence that God has led you through valleys before. He's led you through valleys before. And when other people are crying out about how dark and how broken everything is, you can go, you know what, this is actually a great moment because this means God's going to be closer to me than he's ever been before. All right, y'all know I'm a movie nerd. And this is a scene from Apollo 13. And the movie came out in the 90s, and some of you all are watching this are probably like, I remember this when it actually happened. You were still alive. You were already alive when this happened, but I was not. But this is one of my favorite movies. I love this movie so much, and this is my favorite scene in the movie. Now, if you're not familiar with this is a scene where everything has, they've done everything they possibly can to get the astronauts back to Earth, okay? If you're not familiar with the story of Apollo 13, everything went wrong as soon as they got into space. They couldn't land on the moon and stuff exploded and they were running out of oxygen, they were running out of power, they were running out of water, you name it, they were running out of it. One of the crew members was actually sick. The other one was, he was a newbie who got brought in at the last minute. So everything that could have gone wrong went wrong. And so they are seconds from the spaceship re-entering the Earth's atmosphere. And these guys over here on the side are talking amongst themselves about basically justifying the fact that this stinks. And they say to each other like, this has all gone wrong. The parachutes might not open. They might not have enough power. The heat shield could have fell apart. This is going to be the darkest hour in the history of NASA. And this guy right here, who is the leader in the control room, turns to them and he says, with all due respect, I think this is going to be our finest hour. I think this is going to be our finest hour. I love that. Now, what you may not know is that this was uttered by a man named Gene Kranz. And Gene was actually an avid Christian. He grew up in a Catholic home. He grew up in a Catholic high school. And even to this day, he talks about his faith. Just last year, during the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 13 mission, he was interviewed and he talked a lot about his faith. But he had been through valleys in his life. And he'd been through all the messes that had happened in the Apollo program up to this moment. And when everybody else said that the world has gotten too dark and everything is falling apart and this is all going to be terrible, he goes, with all due respect, this is going to be our finest hour. I think this is going to be our finest hour. Last year, in August, Gene Kranz was asked during an interview leading up to, again, the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 13 mission, he was asked if he'd ever felt stress, okay? And Think about what he went through in that control room. They got to get these 3 men. No one had ever died in outer space before, and he has to be the guy that gets them home. And he says, I was asked if I'd ever felt stressed before. No matter what, I always felt the presence of God in my work and life. Wow, right? Wow. That no matter what was going on, he knew that God was with him. And just the knowledge that God was with him made him resilient. And hear my heart, okay? He got to say this because he'd been down in the valley so many times before. Now, I say all of this to say that I think we as Christians are actually much more resilient than we give ourselves credit for. So many times we face darkness and we forget. Our memories are really short. As human beings, all of our memories are really short. And so when change happens and we go through that curve, that moment of denial is almost a moment where we kind of forget our faith for a minute. And it may be really quick for you, depending on how long you've been a Christian, but we kind of just forget, right? And then we go into this moment of despair because we just forget whose side we're on. And the truth is, those of us, if you're watching this, I'm going to guess. I don't know you and I can't see your face, but I'm going to guess that you've been through valleys before. And you've been through moments where you're like, I just don't know how I'm going to make it over this. I just don't know how I'm going to make through this. I just don't know how I can survive this. And you did, because you're still here. This is kind of a lead-in to Kelly's Bible study for next week, but this is where I want to close. So I was born in 1985. And the first presidential election that I was able to vote in was actually the 2004 election. And I'm thinking about that because we've got such a high-profile election coming up. And unless you've been living under a rock, you know all of the stuff that's been going on of how heated the debate between these two guys are. But I remember in 2004, this was the first time I could ever vote. And the election was between these two guys, right? George Bush and John Kerry. And I remember hearing, I was trying to figure out what it looked like to vote because I was just 18 and I didn't quite, understand everything. My mom and dad kind of told me where to go to the polling site. I knew I had to go behind the curtain, but I was trying to figure how do you know who to vote for? Just a kid. And I remember hearing people that I love go, I just don't know that I can take 4 more years of this. Like if you weren't going to vote for Bush, you were saying that. And if you were going to vote for, we weren't going to vote for Kerry. So I just don't know how I could take 4 years of this, right? Well, you did, right? And then 2008 came along, and I'll never forget this. I remember the debate between McCain and Obama, and people saying, we just can't take 4 years with this person. You just can't take 4 years with that person, and the whole country's just going to be a terrible mess, and we can't survive 4 years. And sure enough, we did. And then in 2012, we did it again, right, with Obama and Romney, and the debate between them was, I just can't take 4 more years of this, or I just couldn't take 4 years of this person, or whatever it might be. And sure enough, we did. And then in 2016, wow, that was not too long ago, and that one's probably still fresh in our minds. I'm hoping I'm not dredging up bad memories, but we said to ourselves, gosh, I just don't know that I could survive 4 years of this person or that person. And sure enough, here we are, even today, leading up to the election happening in just a couple weeks. And we're saying the same thing, y'all. The world is saying the same thing. Oh my gosh, how are we ever going to survive 4 years of this or 4 more years of that? And we will. We will. Because first of all, we're more resilient than we give ourselves credit for. But second of all, when we forget our faith and we forget who we belong to and who we are and whose we are, we allow that channel of despair to take over in a way in our life it was never meant to. We allow our emotions to lead rather than the hope that's been planted in us in Jesus. We allow the change to do the wrong work in us. When I told you about perseverance completing its work, when we read that from James chapter 1 2 weeks ago, I said it has to complete its work, not the work of despair, not the work of our emotions going crazy and making us not think logically, or hatred or bitterness that's kind of rooted itself in us. No, perseverance has to finish its work so we will be resilient. And I think we as Christians need to learn this lesson too, and this is the last thing I'm going to say. If we walk through the tough stuff, and we're not strengthened through that trial, we just allow it to beat us up and we allow it to just make us survive rather than becoming resilient. We don't allow God to finish his work in us and to strengthen us through what we're facing. We deprive God of the opportunity to strengthen us and our faith and those around us. I've said it before and I'll say it again. We don't know what holds in the balance. We don't know what or who holds in the balance of our decision to remain faithful when the whole world around us is screaming for us not to be. We don't know what hangs in the balance of how God could make us more resilient, or what God might be doing in the midst of this small, trivial disruption. We don't know what God might be doing and what holds in the balance in the future of our lives. All we really know is that we're facing a moment, right? We're all in a moment. And whether you like this or not, people are going to write books about 2020, right? People are going to be writing books for years to come about what happened this year. And I think the story that I would like told about myself and the rest of the church is that we were resilient, that we persevered through hardship and we persevered through adversity, but we were resilient. We bounced back stronger than we were before we went into the year. And I am actually excited about what God might be doing in our church and in our world through the adversity that we're facing right now. And I hope that you are too. I'm going to ask you to bow your heads with me. We're going to pray. And then we're going to move into our time of discussion. So wherever you are, just bow your head with me for just one moment. God, when emotions get high in our lives and we face change, none of us like it. None of us like change. None of us like disruption. None of us like difficulty coming our way. But God, you use it, and you use it in such profound and amazing ways. So God, as we lean into this time of disruption, if we lean into this time of change and chaos that seems to be going on, help us to ask you the question. Help us to be honest in our prayers and say, God, what might you be doing? What do you want me to see? What do you want me to hear? Whose voice am I supposed to be listening to? What might you be preparing me for? God, help us to be resilient, to stretch, to allow you to stretch and mold our faith and pull on it, but actually to help us snap back stronger and wider and deeper than we were before, completely enveloped in the love of Christ. So that when change comes and avalanches over top of us, we are prepared. And we're more prepared than we were the last time change came. Because we trusted you and we leaned in and we held on with all that we were. And I ask this in Christ's holy name, and all God's people said, amen. We're going to take just a few minute break, and then I will see you in the Zoom room, all right? God bless.